Welcome back to the Academy Table. I'm Renee DeSilva, CEO of the Academy, and your host. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Neal Hogan. Neal is a leader on healthcare climate change and sustainability. Last year, Neal founded Healthcare Climate ActionWorks, a national organization that partners with health systems to understand their role in fighting climate change and to help the industry reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Neal is also an author, Leading on Climate Change, How Healthcare Leaders Stop Global Warming. I learned a ton from my time with Neal. And reflecting now, we should feel empowered that our industry can and should lead on this issue. I also left the conversation feeling a bit overwhelmed at the complex challenges and how much progress we need to make in a relatively short period of time. Here are my takeaways from the conversation. First, Neal is encyclopedic on this issue. Pay attention to his recommendations for organizations looking to take the first step. It starts with the basics, educating the C-suite, the board, and other decision makers, and then a baseline understanding on current emissions and energy use. If you're like me and knew very little, he does a very good job of walking us through key terms, net zero, scopes of emissions, ESG scores, among many, many other terms. So listen and learn from Neal on that. Next, I liked Neal's assessment of the external and government forces that can help health systems move the needle more quickly. He's a fan of climate risk scores and SEC mandating emission disclosures. But at the other end of the spectrum, thinks that HHS and CMS should treat climate action the way that we did quality, mandate and incentivize performance to drive faster progress. I loved that analogy. And finally, the core of Neal's work is his belief that the climate crisis is, in fact, a healthcare crisis. As he said, there's a true moral imperative here, and inaction is not an option. I know that each day our members work to create healthier communities and patients, and it's clear to me that climate change, climate action ought to be a part of that commitment. So with that, join me at the table. Good morning, Neal. Welcome to the table.
Good morning, Renee. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is. So you and I've had the pleasure of knowing you now for probably more than 20 years, and you've had such a broad healthcare career, strategy work, consulting, serving in a number of executive roles. But most recently, you co-founded the Healthcare Climate ActionWorks. Tell me a little bit about that organization.
Sure. Well, the Healthcare Climate ActionWorks really is ultimately designed to help healthcare organizations understand the challenges of climate change and think through their role in dealing with climate change and reducing their emissions, and ultimately to give them practices to engage with and solve that problem. And, health systems have gotten started on this work. There is sort of a leading group, like there always is in every endeavor that we see in healthcare for the last 30 years. There's, 10 or 20 that get started. They break a lot of the ground, and then you have 20 or 30 fast followers. And then you have the 400 other health systems that start to get lessons from those organizations. So we're trying to make that happen a little bit faster.
That's great. So in addition to your day job, you found some time across the last couple of years to write a book on this topic. And so I wonder just how did you become interested in sustainability and climate change? Where did that interest come from?
Yeah, it goes back. So I have a PhD in the history of science from Harvard. And when you're being prepared in a PhD program, part of what you're being prepared for is research and writing. And the other part is to be prepared for going to some college, university, and teaching. And when you're learning the history of science, they recognize that you're probably going to end up somewhere and be the history of science person and have to teach, the history of nuclear physics and the history of medicine, the history of environmental science. So you need to take courses across a pretty broad array of disciplines. And that's where I really was first introduced to the discipline of environmental science. So that was back in the 80s. And it really was big concerns about climate change that we knew publicly. In the book, I talk about how this goes back to the early 20th century. But That's where I first got introduced to it. And I tracked with it for quite a long time, didn't make it a central part of my life until about 20 years ago, where I really started to become concerned. And my friends who had been in that program started talking to me more about it. And I started to do all the things that you do. So my house is completely powered by the solar field that I built out behind it. And we've got the electric cars, the electric heat pumps and all that stuff. But several years ago, I have a business partner who you know, Jonathan Fullerton, and we were talking about things we might like to do next. We're sort of serial entrepreneurs. And he suggested that I get into climate change and work on climate change. And I said, well, I've kind of separated my work in climate change, where I've been involved in 350.org, which is a sort of action group on politics and climate change, or the New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, from my healthcare business life. And he said, I think you really ought to look at it from the perspective of the business impact of climate change on health systems. And that really started the whole journey. I started working on the book before we launched the company, and, really learned that healthcare is a little bit behind on this, one. And two, I can't imagine an industry that should be more focused on this than healthcare, because, as I say, the climate crisis is a healthcare crisis.
So let's stay on that for a moment. Why is the climate crisis a healthcare crisis?
Yeah, I go back to the beginning of this. It's just, we have fantastic lives because we have access to energy. I just was reading a book last week. Vaclav Smil and has a new book out called How the World Really Works. And he calculates the benefits we get from the energy we've developed across the last 200 years. And every person in the U.S., because of the energy we have, that we can throw food in a microwave, jump on our car and go someplace and fly across the country, we have the equivalent of the services of a staff that's larger than Louis XIV at the height of Versailles. So energy has been fantastic for us. The problem is most of our energy, the vast majority, comes from burning stuff. So oil, coal, natural gas. And burning that stuff does two things. One, it creates pollution, which is the little particles of junk that you see in the air. And the other, it creates carbon dioxide, or CO2. Well, those particles of junk, smaller than 2.5 microns, they get in our lungs and our bloodstream, and they increase morbidity and mortality for cardiovascular and pulmonary conditions, even cause brain damage. And they're estimated to kill about 8 million people every year, including 100,000 in the United States. So right now, forget about climate change, just burning that stuff is killing more Americans than medical errors do. So we should have a big concern about that. And then when you get to the CO2 part with climate change, I think everybody knows, and we read about it every day, more fires, more drought, more heat. I mean, right now you're probably seeing stories about India and Pakistan seeing the impact of more heat. Humans can't survive above a wet bulb temperature of 95 degrees. So that's when you have 100% humidity and 95 degree weather, you will just die. There's no way around it unless you can get into air conditioning. And only 10% of Indians have air conditioning. And it's approaching a wet bulb temperature of 95. So you're starting to see weaker people who can't get to air conditioning die from that. And we saw that in Chicago a few years ago. So that's why I think it's a healthcare crisis.
And my next question was going to be, I mean, when you frame it that way, certainly there's also, maybe I'll call it a moral imperative, just given the toll that it takes on lives and on people. But let's also talk through, how have you seen organizations frame up the business case for taking the steps required to move forward on this issue?
Yeah, one of the things, I really was interested in when I started to do research on this is, I had really thought of it as very political, and I didn't really want to wade into it because, it is a very political issue and it's very divisive. But then I started to read more about, the business organizations and the Business Roundtable, which, if you're familiar, the Business Roundtable is not a far left group of street huggers. It issued a statement on climate change that said, unchecked climate change poses significant environmental, economic, public health, and security threats to countries around the world, including the U.S. And I started to realize there's an entire business movement to address climate issues. And there's two big problems for companies, including health systems. One is mitigation. That's trying to figure out how we continue to lead the fantastic lives we lead and have the fantastic things that we have, but to do that with renewable energy rather than burning fossil fuels. And the other is adaptation, which is we've already increased 1 degree. There's a study that just came out last week. There's a 50% chance within the next 5 years we're going to go to 1.5 degrees, which we were trying to prevent happening by the end of the century. We're moving up pretty fast, and things are going to change, and can companies deal with that? So there's a huge movement among the Fortune 500 companies, among investors in Fortune 500 companies, and so on, to figure out a way to reduce their emissions and to reduce their risk from the impacts of climate change.
There's a lot of vocabulary and nomenclature that is thrown around, and I think it's just worth having, just setting some definition. So when many companies have made either carbon neutral or net zero commitments, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Renee. And that is one of the things I've learned in the last year talking to health systems. And there's a couple of dozen health systems that have sustainability directors. And those people know more than I do. I mean, they know it in and out. But then you have boards and executive teams of health systems. And when you speak to boards and executive teams, they don't know a lot of sort of fundamental things. And I don't expect they should yet. I mean, I think this is a time to start getting educated on it. So net zero is when it really was originally done globally. The globe has to get to net zero by 2050. And that meant that we had to stop burning coal, oil, and gas. But there would probably be a few things that we couldn't do and keep the great lifestyles we have unless we burned coal, oil, and gas. So there'd have to be a couple of things we'd be stuck with. Maybe making steel is one of them. Mm-hmm. And so in that case, we'd have to offset, that's another one of these definitions, or buy credits to offset the emissions from that oil, coal, or gas you're using to make that steel. And you do that by taking carbon out of the atmosphere at the same rate that you were putting it in. You can do things like plant trees is one of them. You can change the way you till soil. You can build farms to grow kelp in the oceans that absorb carbon. So net zero for a company has come to mean that as well. If there's things we can't get to zero, we'll offset it by doing other activities that take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you for that.
And if you want to, if you don't mind, I'll give you one or two other definitions that I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, please do.
For this conversation. So one would be ESG. I think a lot of people are familiar with this now. This is environmental, social, and governance investing. The amount of money invested into ESG has increased tenfold from 2018 to 2020. And last year, it doubled again. About $120 billion went into sustainable investments last year. That's double what 2020 was. About a third of all assets have sustainable investments. So investors are saying, we are looking at how companies deal with social issues. Do they have a diverse board? But very importantly, are they accounting for and lowering their emissions? So ESG is a driving force on the business. And then the other thing I think could be definition, so we've done net zero and we've done ESG, is scopes of emissions. So when you do account for your emissions, there's 3 scopes that you have to think about. The first is what comes out of your own smokestack. So for a health system, anesthetic gases, for example, are warming the atmosphere. Health systems usually burn natural gas to do their heating and cooling of their buildings. So that's scope 1. And, their transport, things like that. Scope 2 is, where does your electricity come from? So if you're getting your electricity from a coal-fired plant, you have very high emissions. If it's all solar or wind, you have 0 emissions. And then scope 3 is your entire supply chain and downstream use of your product. Scope 3 for just about every company is 80% of total emissions. It is much more. And our friend Chaz Rhodes at Grist actually did a great infographic where he took some research that was done by Neal showing for a health system where they stand on these different scopes.
And is scope 3 generally the hardest to get to zero on, just given that some of that is not necessarily directly within your control?
Absolutely. So Kaiser Permanente, who I would say is the leader in this, which has gotten to net zero in scope 1 and scope 2, built 2 giant solar farms, 2 giant wind farms, put solar on many, many of their buildings, has built a 0 emissions medical office building. They have not even laid out their goal for scope 3 yet, because it is incredibly complicated and difficult, and they want to be careful to not, put out a goal they can't reach. So they're still in the research phase of what that goal should be.
It's fascinating. So you mentioned Kaiser Permanente as an exemplar on the healthcare side. Are there out-of-industry organizations that come to mind that are set apart in their commitment and progress on this front?
Yeah, there's so many. When I wrote the book, I really, I would say about 80% of Fortune 500 companies are engaged in emissions reductions of some level at this point. And I focused on 4 just to take sort of emblematic things. And one that I think comes to mind very quickly for people is Patagonia. Patagonia has made, the entire environmental issue central to its business model. It attracts people who are outdoorsy, and it wants to make sure that people believe in that. Patagonia's mission statement is actually one sentence, which is, we're in the business to save our home planet.
That's clear and powerful.
That's pretty clear and powerful. And they have, value statements that have things like conduct operations causing no unnecessary harm. So they've made a mission commitment to this. But then I look at other sort of parts of the puzzle. IKEA, they realized they're a very large, complex organization, thousands of different components that they sell. They have a very long supply chain process. They have stores. And they realized they're going to have to make this part of every leader's job. And so instead of just having the director of sustainability, they have a sustainability council, which is essentially all of their executive leaders. And that looks at metrics and see, are they achieving what they've said they were achieving? And then Honeywell's, the third one in the book that I talk about, they actually have a fantastic system for tracking their projects. So they have gotten to 85% of the way of reducing their emissions to zero. That took 5,700 discrete projects to do that. And they sort of have a tight, loose, tight approach where they set a metric. They let you go out and figure out how to solve it as your team that understands the local problem. And then they come back and say, did you achieve the metric? And then the last one I talk about is Disney, because they are very, very thorough about their purchase of credits or offsets. There's a lot of greenwashing that goes on when people buy their offsets, that it looks like they're doing something, but if you kind of get deeper into it, the forest they planted really is going to die next year. Or, it doesn't really remove carbon from the atmosphere, whatever they've done. And Disney's being really careful about buying excellent credits. But I could have looked at hundreds of companies. And I think out of industry, we're lucky in healthcare. We've got a lot of great examples of ways to get at this.
It's fascinating. As you were talking through some of these examples where it's probably been decades of effort, right, that start to culminate. I wonder for maybe organizations that are earlier stage, how do you think about advising on where to start? And maybe hit that both from, the action projects, but also just what's the right way to think about governance and decision-making around all these discrete initiatives?
Yeah, I'm really a broken record when people talk to me about this, and I'm hoping I don't turn into the broken record for you today, which is I think there's so much education that's got to be done, and it's taken me a lot of education to get to my understanding of this where I am now. It's an unbelievably complicated process, and when you think about what I said in the beginning, our whole lives are built upon fossil fuel energy. Everything we do. And to transition out of that is incredibly complicated. And just the things like we talked about earlier, definitions. So I think number one, you got to get your board and your executive team to get a little deeper in this and understand what's going on and get an understanding of how many other companies are engaged in this, that this is past the political argument. And it's really now looking at business solutions for this. So that would be number one thing. And then second, companies have to find their baseline. What are they emitting? And this sounds so simple, but when you talk to any organization, any large health system, this is incredibly complicated. Here's one of the difficulties. Most large health systems who might own hundreds of buildings do not know their rolled up electricity use, right? That's not been important. They have divisions, and the divisions have P&Ls. And that division has a medical office building, and they know that their electricity is there, but we don't compare that to the hospital. Rolling that up can actually take 2 years. Mm-hmm. So just getting started to find your baseline. And I think you want to do things in parallel, but that's one that you really got to get started on. And then, the biggest thing you can do as any organization, any individual, is understand where your electricity comes from and transition that to a renewable source. So Intermountain Healthcare just recently partnered with the utility in their states and said, we want you to go build renewable generation, and we will guarantee we will buy all those electrons from you. And that's a huge step that can eliminate their largest emissions aside from scope 3.
Really interesting. As you're talking, I'm just also aware of external forces that are at play that are sort of converging on or putting greater executive attention on it. And I know that you're tracking all of this. So last year, Fitch Ratings established a climate risk score. In March, the SEC opened comments on mandating climate and emissions-related disclosures. I think HHS has a voluntary climate change pledge for hospitals. What's your general impression of all of these actions, and is it sufficient to move us as quickly as we need to move?
Well, since I've become immersed in this, I don't think there is something that's quick enough so you need to move. I cannot press on people that once you start to get further educated about this, you start to really realize we are so far behind and we have a lot to do. So, for example, if you just went with the IPCC, the UN's organization that's been working on this for 25 years, we put about 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere every year. We've got to go to zero. They say that if we go 400 billion more tons, we will exceed 2 degrees. And remember, the typical temperature of the Earth is about 13 degrees centigrade. So 2 degrees increase is about 15% increase. That's a lot of extra heat. Mm. So 400 billion tons, well, that's only 8 years of our current rate of emissions. So we're not going to make that, right? So we've got a big problem. We're going to move faster. So what do I think about those different things you mentioned? So Fitch's climate risk score are fantastic. Fitch, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, they've all acquired companies that can more effectively evaluate the accounting of emissions and more effectively evaluate the risk. So this has to do with that mitigation and adaptation. They want to be careful about investing in a company or and rating a company that is in a flooding area or an area of sea level rise or an area of lots of fires. That's the adaptation part. So that's the risk. So that's their climate risk score. The SEC, I think this is the most important thing that will happen in the next few years is when the SEC standardize how we account for emissions. That's going to be a bellwether for the entire world because then every company will use the same format. So if you follow, let's say, Apple, and you look at Apple, which has tried to do a really good job accounting for their emissions, if you go year to year through their sustainability reports, there's a wide variation from year to year of what they think their emissions are because they keep adapting their accounting because they're trying to be honest about it, but there is no standard. So they keep on adjusting to be more honest. So when the SEC does that, I think there's nothing more important. It's going to be the battle of the century when they determine what the accounting standard is. Because just think of, a company that's going to be evaluated will be ExxonMobil or BP or Shell. And they're going to be accountable for scope 3, which includes you and I burning that gas in our cars. So they're going to be very aggressive on not wanting the standards to be too tough. And on the other hand, there's going to be a whole bunch of people trying to push it to be tougher. So those are very important. The climate pledge from the Department of Health and Human Services, I was very disappointed in, to be honest. We have an Office of Climate and Social Equity, and the thing that's come out of them is, could you all volunteer to do this? We need CMS to do what it did on quality in our lifetimes. We used to have no metrics on quality. Then the first metric was aspirin at MI. And for those of you who were in the industry like I was back then, about 60% of patients got an aspirin at MI when they first tested for that metric. The moment that they measured it and gave an incentive to hospitals to change, it went to 95% within the next 2 years. We need CMS to do this same thing. We need them to say, here's the standard. Here's our expectation, and here's the incentive. Because the places that want to volunteer to do this have already volunteered. They're not being driven by CMS.
So interesting. Well, let's zoom in a bit. So one of the roles that you play is you serve on a board for a large health system. And so I wonder, maybe just reflecting on that experience, you also do a lot of advising to boards and CEOs. So what is your message? I know you said the importance of boards being activated around it, but do you have thoughts on how best to start to engage in that conversation? Do you just start with education and level setting and then get into what ought to be prioritized? But how do you advise boards to lead on climate action?
That's a great question. First, let me just say I've been working with boards since 1996, did my first board retreat, where I led a board retreat for a board then, and I've done hundreds of those since. And I love to work with boards. And I'm on the board of Integris Health in Oklahoma. Been on that board for 6 years now, I think. I tell people it's the best professional experience of my lifetime because the people on that board are so dedicated to the mission, spend so much time working to make sure our finances are secure, that we have excellent quality and so on. And it's just an honor to be on that board with those folks. And we have a great leader in Tim Person, our CEO. And so I feel for boards because, I've worked with the boards for about 30 years and, there's always a crisis in healthcare. And right now we have a really severe crisis. So our recruitment retention issues are through the roof, which means we have very high demands for salary increases, which means our margins, which are always slimmer, under incredible pressure. Not to mention everyone is exhausted from a couple of years of dealing with a pandemic. So I think, there's just an enormous amount of pressure. And I feel a little bad being the guy who's out there saying, yeah, but we really must have to work on emissions reduction and work on climate change because there's a whole business approach to this, that we can do this in a way that's good for us. So the first thing I think boards have to do is get into the idea of getting educated about this and learning about this. I worry a little bit that we are still in the hangover of this being a political issue. Mm-hmm. And I worry a little bit that if I'm the CEO of a health system, is this something I want to bring up? I think it's going to get easier and easier for CEOs to bring up as, investors drive this issue for bonds. You mentioned Fitch, and I mentioned Standard & Poor's and Moody's coming down the same road. I think as it becomes more of a bond issue and a bond rating issue, that will help. I think if CMS pushes, it will help. But I also worry that if we wait for all that to happen, we are getting way too far behind. As I said, it takes a few years to even gear up and ramp up. So I am hoping that my work, the book, will make people feel less threatened about it. It's focused specifically on health systems. I focus explicitly on the business case for why you do this. And I'm hoping that our educational programs we can do. And I'm hoping things like this. I've told everybody, one of the scary parts of climate change is we actually, after we get done stopping emissions, we're going to have to take about 1 trillion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere to get the temperature back down. And so I tell everybody we're all on team trillion tons. And Renee, I've just inducted you into team trillion tons on this. Any organization that's working on this, I want to work with them and I want to help them get to that next level.
Yeah, I think it's a great conversation to have. It comes up in some of our, as you know, at the Academy, we're pulling together executives quite regularly. And I think people want to have the conversation. It comes up in some of our content calls. We've not always really had the maybe framework or right way to have it, but I'm glad that you and I are having this conversation because no good deed will go unpunished. Hopefully you'll come and share this message with our groups live at some point in the next couple of months because I do think it's an appetite.
I've been so lucky working with the Academy because I've actually presented to the Academy over the years, and then for the last 6 years, Integris is a member. We've gone to the trustee retreats.
Yes.
And, they are a great opportunity for education. And for boards in particular, the opportunity to interact with other boards, because boards, unlike executives, are not going out. I mean, I'm going out like you do, Renee, to lots of different programs. And I'm thinking about healthcare all the time. And I'm learning about healthcare all the time. But my fellow incredibly smart, mission-driven, capable board members are running their own businesses. And so when they get an opportunity to go to an Academy program, they get a chance to talk to board members of other health systems. And it's very powerful. They come back and talk about it after every meeting. We were talking to the guys at Scott and White, or we were talking to the guys at Providence. and we learned this. And it's a very powerful way. And so, having the Academy involved in being part of Team Trillion Tons, I think is a big forward movement for the effort.
So let me take us in a little bit of a different direction, more of a curiosity for me. So is this the first book that you've written?
No, I wrote a book coming out of graduate school on the history of medical malpractice, and I strongly urge no one to read. It has a wonderful impact in that no one had written a history of medical malpractice in the 20th century before. And so wonderfully, I have to be cited by any really good historian who's writing a quality book about law and medicine interacting. But, it's just, it's an early book. And as you know, at the advisory board, having spent 15 years, thinking about how to get message across to people, I look back in that book and realize, man, I did not get that message out. And then I've written a lot of white papers. In fact, you had Tom Lee on recently, and Tom Lee, the first white paper I wrote for BBC Advisors, I ran into Tom Lee, who I didn't know at the time, actually. And he pulled me aside and gave me this very nice compliment about the white paper. And when he left, and I just thought this again when I was listening to him on your podcast, I just thought, that guy was so nice to even remember that he read my piece and then to comment to me about it. And in the years since, knowing Tom Lee better and better over the years, everyone I talk to tells me a similar story. He's so engaged with people. And he's such a great guy.
He is. My question for you on the book side of things would be, if you had a single piece of advice for folks listening who may think they have a book in them, how does one even start the process of getting their own story drafted?
Wow, interesting question. I am a hoarder of articles and information. So I have a giant file of digital information that I have multiple files within, so I can figure it out. And so as I started to think about writing the book, I started to look at that information that I had and look through it and think through the possibility. And then I literally just sat down and wrote out what did I think the 7 chapters should be, or the 8 chapters should be. I think 7 chapters. And I just thought, I got to explain it's a health crisis. I'm going to have to give people information about the climate, like understand some climate science, because if they don't totally buy into this, I want them to just understand that it's a very easy scientific issue to understand. Then I wanted to talk about how other businesses are being pressured to do this, and the whole thing when we were talking about the SEC and the ESG investing. And then I wanted to talk about how they take climate action. And then I moved into a roadmap for health systems to take climate action. So it was a pretty easy way to lay it out. And then I took all the articles I had, kind of laid it into there, and then I thought through what's the argument I want to make. And that concept is pretty basic for writing a book or writing a white paper. Mm-hmm. The trick is then sitting down and actually doing it.
Yeah.
And the first person that I acknowledge in the book is my wonderful wife, who in the acknowledgments, I promised that I will not talk about climate change until after she's had her first cup of coffee, because she had to suffer through, getting up in the morning. I already been up writing, and then me coming down and going, that's terrible things happening. Yeah. And so, you just have to kind of grind it out, and that is not fun. I mean, grinding out a book is not fun. It's sort of torturous work.
Yeah. Well, deep respect for people who can organize themselves and then just commit to getting up and writing every day. So kudos to you on that. Well, great. Here's my final question for you. And it's a take on one that I ask all of my guests, which is, if you could invite 2 people to continue this conversation today that you'd get inspiration from, that you think has a good perspective on this, what 2 people would you invite and why?
Yeah. So my first answer to that question, I'm going to give you 2 answers, is I invite those 2 people to my table every night, which is my wife and my daughter, who are fantastic at bouncing thoughts about this off of. And again, so they're tortured by having to talk about my topic. So I kudos to them for having done it. And they've given me so much great thinking that I've incorporated in my stuff. But I think, what would be interesting would be, there's 2 kind of leaders in thinking about climate change right now. One is Bill McKibben, who was a writer for The New Yorker. If you have a chance to read any of his work, I highly recommend it. In fact, The New Yorker has an anthology of their climate writing called The Fragile Earth, which has quite a bit of his stuff in it. And he wrote for years about climate change, and then decided that that wasn't going to be enough. He was going to have to start an organization. He started 350.org. And he is just a leader in the fight to try to get us to reduce emissions and figure this out. And I have huge respect for Bill. And then the other person would actually be Bill Gates, who wrote a book 2 or 3 years ago about climate change. And the reason I'd like to have both of them on is they both agree we absolutely have to get to zero by 2050, but they have completely different viewpoints about how we should do it. And I think it'd be really interesting to have that chat. Bill Gates is much more on the technology is going to solve all of our problems. And we'll be able to take a ton of carbon out, lots of carbon out of the atmosphere, and we'll be able to do these different things. And Bill McKibben is more on we don't need to wait for the technology. We already have solar and wind. We just need the political will to make it happen. And I'm not sure that they're too far apart, but it would be a great conversation. They both are very deep on climate change and the business approach to solving the problem. I'd love to talk to them about it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Neal. I feel much more educated than I was at the beginning of this conversation. And I applaud the conversation that you're driving and look forward to continuing it with you over time. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much, Renee. It's really an honor. When I look at the folks that you've had on, especially this season, I was listening to a couple of podcasts last week, and I just feel very honored to be part of that group. And thank you so much for having me join you at this table.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Thanks again for joining me at The Table. The Table is a podcast produced by the Health Management Academy. Make sure you catch future episodes by visiting our website, theacademytable.com, or by subscribing on the podcast platform of your choice. And if you have suggestions for topics or guests, I'd love to hear from you. Please drop me a note at Renee@hmacademy.com. I look forward to talking with you soon.